So Jordan, we entitled this session "The Meta Crisis" as a forcing function for sovereignty. And I thought it would just be good to start with a couple definitions. So what is your latest definition of sovereignty? We got to unmute Jordan as well.
Interesting. I had to give permission to Peter giving permission to me being unmuted. It's Zoom is becoming very consent-based. It hasn't changed actually in quite some time, but I think the nuance is a little bit tricky. And I think there's a very nice way of walking in from something like sovereignty into virtue. So I'd like to just kind of put that out there. The first point is something like it's contextual. So we can say that in the context of, for example, skateboarding, Tony Hawk is substantially more sovereign than I am. Right? This has to do with his holistic competency in the context to select choices and effectuate those choices so as to further a possibility of his next step. Right? That's the notion. Right? The notion is you're always in a continuous process of being in relationship with your context. And the challenge is, can you dispose of yourself? Can you coordinate a set of choices and effectuate them in the world such that your next context is a broader, more open field of possibility? And that's the essence of it. And then what we can notice is that we can say, okay, in its most fundamental sense, it's intrinsically bound to context. And also, we can speak about the generality of it. So the more sets of contexts in which one can maintain a certain level of sovereignty, particularly above the threshold of reciprocal closing. Right? So we say that there's a particular line of sovereignty where reciprocal closing becomes the dominant force. For example, I'm going to shift from skateboarding to surfboarding because my sovereignty in skateboarding is quite poor. If I've reached that very particular point in surfing where I'm no longer on my board, right? I'm not yet obviously fallen off, but it's the point, the threshold is crossed. I'm going to draw that as a particular line. So that line is the reciprocal closing is now the dominant attractor in the system. I can say, can I generalize across all possible contexts? Right? So capital S sovereign would be able to achieve this notion of contextually bound sovereignty above that minimum threshold across all possible contexts, which of course is an abstraction, right? There's no being other than perhaps being, capital B, that could achieve that, but that gives us an orienting basis of what it would look like. And now we're in the complexity of just life. Where do you choose to allocate your time and energy in the sense of which contexts do you perceive as the ones that are most meaningful in your sort of upcoming, as you're encountering context? Are you, for example, spending your time training your capacity in surfing when in fact you should have trained your capacity in growing food, for example? So that you get to different levels of meta in terms of how you actually even begin the process of engaging which allocations of capacity building. So you can notice there's a lot of complexity in this concept, but once you get the basic ideas, you can see that it's in some sense very simple. And then, because the nature of the reality is complex, there's a complexity of how it plays out in reality.
So there's two things that come to mind when hearing that. The first is a quote by Forrest Landry, where, and he's riffed on this in a few ways, but the quote that comes to mind is, "Love is that which enables choice." And often the optimal choice is the choice that increases your choice making across time. And I feel like, you said a lot there, but the way that I'm parsing it out is within that quote. Would you say that's accurate?
Yes.
And so that goes to the second thing, which you said in the beginning, that you think there's a nice way to tie this into virtue. So I'd love to hear you do that and see if you can tie it into the concept of love as well.
Yeah, I would say it seems to me pretty straightforward. If you imagine over a very long period of time, evolving organisms are inevitably engaging with a variety of contexts, in each case endeavoring to resolve the question of how to achieve sovereignty. And this is a general question. It's not a human question. And particular capacities, particular dispositions, and in particular bases of choice have a certain conservation law. right? They show up as being almost always or quite often the best, right? The ones that if you have these as part of your basic operating system, you're going to show up as having sovereignty in your experience. And so I would say that the virtues are that sort of thing, right? They are hard learned, almost like discovered geometries in sovereignty space, that if we orient ourselves towards them, we get the benefit of all those who have come before us to simplify our task of navigating the complex space of sovereignty. And then, as Forrest points out, the Urheimat, right, the most foundational, most generalizable, is the basis of love, meaning all virtues are ultimately grounded in that as their basis from which they come.
How would you define love in that context?
Well, you already said it. Love is that which enables choice.
And so what I'm getting from that is if there's some sort of driving function behind what we're doing here, we're a bunch of people here trying to cultivate sovereignty. We are trying to increase our capacity to make choices. I feel like there's something missing there.
Can I, maybe some tools?
Mm-hmm.
One tool, proper order in relationship between meaning and the way that we describe meaning. So if I say love is that which enables choice, many people will endeavor to do something like work backwards from their pre-existing semantic framework that they've attached to the notion love. So they do like a definitional mapping. Wait, I've got this cluster of notions that describe this phenomenon. How do I try to do a translation mapping between that and this other set of words here? I would propose that is not proper order. Proper order would be something like remembering or bringing oneself into the first person experience, particular moments, and ideally a diversity of moments, a multiplicity of moments where the thing that is named love shows up. And begin to notice at the level of experience, not at the level of semantics, what is the thing we're talking about. And then from that, getting a fully embodied large system sensibility of what it is we're talking about, and then begin to use that as the way of doing the, here's what the words have been talking about. And so in that direction. And then same thing there. Right? The notion of choice is not obvious. Mm-hmm. We have the way I've been describing it to my wife is we've been living a very long time in upside down land, or maybe inside out land. And so oftentimes our notions of what things are in fact very distinctly not what they actually are. Right? For example, there's a big ambiguity in many people's minds between the notion of selection and the notion of choice. Yeah. And I would propose that those are not the same thing. In fact, they are almost perfectly opposite. To make a selection from a menu, for example, is not choice. Choice is precisely unbound by a pre-existing domain. So if we begin to think about what is this thing we're calling choice, Forrest also says something like, it's more proper to say that choice has self than that selves make choices. Already with that way of framing it really exposes topsy-turvy land. So maybe that tool will help.
So based on that, how should we think about the choices that we have in a given day? And I'll tell you where this is coming from. I've heard you speak before in different contexts about the importance of our decisions. And what you did right now as well, just kind of reframing things and disabusing us of some of the baggage we have with our words, all of a sudden like locked me in a little bit into the moment and made me realize like, oh, actually this day is significant. Even though it's a Wednesday and I have to get back to work after this and there's all these mundane things, it just kind of shifted everything and made me realize, okay, there's a space here that's very significant that I keep forgetting and I need to be reminded of. And so the question I'm searching for is, how do I take that deeper definition of choice, and keep that salient to me throughout my daily life, and realize that what I do actually matters, which is, I think, what you're implying in what you're saying.
Yeah, that's very nice. This notion of significance and the notion of mundane, which, by the way, links very nicely to the notions of sacred and profane. One might say that the thing that one is endeavoring to do is to live fully and always in the sacred, and to enact the sacred in relationship with the sacred, and that is always present. To recognize the infinite significance that is omnipresent might be a way of pointing towards it. And then to recognize precisely the very specific thing you're bringing up. How do I say this? Not the banal, but the actual deeply profound. Oh, it turns out that I'm constantly finding myself in a circumstances of inappropriately forgetting the significance of the moment that I am in, and projecting what would just happen.
Someone was off mute. I think we're good.
And inappropriately projecting the notion of significance on a reification of experience. Does that make sense?
I don't know if I understood that last bit. Maybe try again.
Let me see it in a slightly different way. Yesterday, I was having brunch with my wife, and she mentioned an experience, or a common form of experience that she finds herself in, where she isn't even aware of the environment, the experience, the reality she's in. She's in her head. That's a pretty common phrase. She's in her head, and her body is moving through space-time, and stuff is going on, but she's in her head. And what this does is this creates a very interesting separation that implies that experience isn't significant unless it has been imbued with significance by mind. Mind goes, oh, no, that's significant. I'm responsible for orienting your attention towards that which is significant. So I'm going to withdraw significance from experience, from the moment, and then I will construct a mechanism whereby I will then imbue experience back into the world. Nietzsche pointed this out very specifically. And the proposition I'm making is something like the exact inverse, which is to notice that significance is intrinsic, and that the challenge is, in fact, how to go about increasing the significance. Right? So it's not like a 1-0 process. It's actually a 1+. How do I engage in the world so as to increase the richness and quality and complexity of experience, to increase the significance of my environment? And this, by the way, loops us all the way back into a very interesting way of thinking about the notion of sovereignty, right? We're starting to hit this thing from different directions. To live artfully, right? We can bring in the notion of art, for example, which is to say, to form clarity and coherence and intensity in the diversity of the field of choices that we express into the world. That's to live artfully.